Okay, everybody, on the left is where these animals get hooked up in the morning. They're going to get to rest here during the day. Come look at that diaper, Richard. It's also where these animals get unhooked at night. Alright gang, welcome aboard again. I'm Andrew, he is de Blasio. We named de Blasio after the mayor in New York City. He's not very fond of carriages in Central Park, so this is kind of an underhanded jab at Mayor Bill de Blasio right here. And he is much more useful than Bill de Blasio, I assure you. He is a French Percheron. French Percherons are any shade of black, white, or gray. The light brown horses that are downtown are called Belgian draft horses. And our company uses draft mules to pull. Those guys are the offspring of a female draft horse and a male donkey. And they've got very large ears and very small feet compared to horses. And then you might have seen the horses with the black and white spots. Those are the American spotted draft horses. Those guys are part French Percheron and part paint. And the paints are what the Native Americans rode in the Westerns. Now, the Clydesdale is one of the more famous breeds of horse, and those animals originated from Scotland. There's a Belgian coming up on the right, and there's another Percheron on the left. So these are draft horses. Draft horses are bred for pulling heavy things. They can pull about 3 to 5 times their own body weight, and most of these guys weigh about a ton. So draft horses aren't going to go fast unless they think there's a grizzly bear chasing them. And most of the carriage animals in the city are ex-Amish. So most of these guys used to pull plows, but now they're semi-retired and doing carriage tours.
Blasio wants to go that way.
You want to take the short
surprising.
tour.
Yeah. All right, 5-minute tour. There you go.
Enough.
So we're heading into the market because we have to get a zone tag before we can officially kick this sucker off. At the moment, there's only 3 zones that are regulated by the city. And again, at the moment, there's 20 carriages allowed out at once. That system was put in place to spread these 5 different carriage tour companies out. So the tag assignments are made on a random basis via an old bingo machine. So I don't exactly know where we're going yet. And I'm not going to know until we check in with the Tourism Commission. They're sitting in that little shack across the parking lot on the right. So when I talk to tourism, I've got to tell them how many people are on board. We pay a tax per person. It's 50 cents per adult, 25 cents per child, and then $3 for the zone tag. The zone tag is like a license plate, and the zones are just sectors within the historic district. It's not a bad zone, there's only bad tour guides. And obviously whatever zone we happen to get is going to be the best. And I'll let you know what my favorite zone is in just a minute. And if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to ask. Questions are kind of our bread and butter. So again, ask away. 11, 3, and 2.
How's Mr. de Blasio?
Not bad, not bad. How you doing? How's Drudge? She's behaving herself? Yeah.
What's up, dude?
I think he's gonna pee. Looks like he's gonna pee. Well, we'll see. Hey! I got 11, 3, and 2 on carriage 298 with de Blasio pulling, please. Yeah.
Spritz.
Well, try to bathe them twice a day, or at least once a day, depending on the time of the year. We'll get a bath before bed, at a minimum. See, luckily black horses don't get that dirty, so.
There you go. Oh, Andy. Yeah.
Hey, long time no see.
And the number is dun, 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 dun.
Thanks.
Number one.
Number one.
That's
We're
my
number
favorite,
one.
of course.
Oh, wow.
Just like Zone 2
How
or Zone
lucky.
3 would be my favorite. All right, see y'all soon. Thanks. All right, fat boy. So we're gonna start off on Church Street. And up ahead of us is gonna be St. Philip's Episcopal Church. The church was built in 1838 and the congregation was established back in 1680. And that's the same year that the settlers landed on this peninsula. So the first minister over here, when he was intoxicated, he baptized a bear cub. It's a very Charlestonian-like thing to do. And we like to say that this is a drinking town with an historical problem. Early on, this water wasn't safe to drink, so as a means of hydrating, people were drinking watered-down alcohol. Hey. So in the 1700s, your average citizen is drinking a couple of bottles of wine and a small bottle of liquor every day.
Sounds like me.
Yeah. But then people started drinking hot tea. And the key to making hot tea is boiling water. And obviously that kills germs. We know that now. They did not know that 300 years ago. Just turns out that tea drinking was a safer and a more sober alternative. So this city had a wall built around it by 1704. Charleston was one of 5 walled cities in North America. So you had the French up at Quebec and Montreal. The Dutch were at New Amsterdam, aka Manhattan. That's where there's a Wall Street. The English were here, and then the Spanish were down at St. Augustine, Florida. So the walls were about 17 feet high and 5 feet thick. And they're made mostly out of dirt. So we're gonna turn on to Cumberland Street in just a second. And Cumberland Street was the northern boundary of the wall. So again, northern boundary, right here. The eastern boundary was East Bay Street, which is up ahead of us. Southern boundary was Water Street, which is off to the right, and the western boundary was Meeting Street, which is behind us. So the walled city was 3 blocks wide by 4 blocks long. We're talking about 60 acres. And the walls were built for protection. So these people needed protection mainly from the hostile French, Spanish, Native Americans, and pirates. Otherwise, there wasn't really a whole lot to worry about. And there used to be a confederation of hostile Native American tribes in the Low Country called the Yamasee. The Yamasee were defeated back in 1717, so the wall started coming down then, came down completely by 1752. So the wall was only up for 48 years. Now you guys have been in the city for more than 5 minutes, so you probably figured out how important preservation is. And the preservation effort started super duper early. It was 1931. The Historical Preservation Society created the Board of Architectural Review. And then the Board of Architectural Review enacted the 75-year rule. So the 75-year rule says that any building downtown that's 75 years or older can't be destroyed. Excuse me. So Charleston has America's strictest preservation laws. We've also got America's largest preserved and historic district. So in terms of size, it's second in the world behind Rome. It's 90 square blocks. And the 75-year rule is still in effect, so the district is growing. Now we call the Historical Society the Hysterical Society. And the BAR is the most ruthless bunch of 120-year-old women that you're ever gonna meet. Now, most people don't have a clue, but Charleston was actually built on the second most active fault line in the nation, called the Woodstock Fault. And a very large earthquake hit downtown on August 31st of 1886. Now, it would have been about a 7.5 on the Richter scale. And that's assuming that the Richter scale was in place back then, but it wasn't. So the number was an estimate. And the estimate was based upon eyewitness accounts and the amount of damage that it did. It was $6 million worth. And we're talking about 1886, so that's right after the Civil War. Nobody here had money to rebuild. I'm not going. Back then, everybody was stuck in repair mode. So if you look to this gray house on the left, in between the windows, those discs are the repair effort after the earthquake. And typically you're going to find a mirror image on the opposite walls. So it's a nut and washer on the outside, and then there's 2 iron rods in between the floor and the ceiling connected by a turnbuckle on the inside. And these people would crank their turnbuckles periodically to bend the walls back into position. So they're called earthquake bolts, and they're similar to braces for teeth. Now we can expect an earthquake relatively regularly, so we may or may not be overdue. But in the meantime, we experience about half a dozen tremors a year, most of which are too small to be felt. Now, people here say that they feel earthquakes, but again, this is a drinking town with an historical problem, so you gotta take those claims with a grain of salt. We're sitting on the Woodstock fault line. It runs from Woodstock, New York, down the coast, passes through Somerville. Somerville's about 25 miles northwest. And then the fault line ends by Cuba. So this whole area is a seismic hotbed. In a lot of cases, people would decorate their washers. We're gonna see what that looks like a little bit later. Heading into the French Quarter, this French Quarter isn't exciting like New Orleans, but it's actually America's oldest. And the French people that came here called French Huguenots, Calvinistic Protestants. They were guaranteed religious freedom in France thanks to the irrevocable Edict of Nantes. They spell it Nantes. So once that edict was revoked, French Huguenots weren't guaranteed religious freedom at home, so they came to Charleston to get it. And the French Huguenot congregation was established here by 1681. It's in the French Quarter where the French Huguenots were living and working. Now in New Orleans, they've got French Catholics, but in Charleston, we're talking about French Protestants, and there's a difference. French Catholics are partiers, and French Protestants are not. So this French Quarter is sort of like the Mickey Mouse version of New Orleans' French Quarter. We got this art gallery coming up on the right. You can see that the bricks are exposed. That is called stucco over brick. In England, the British love building with stone, but we don't have stone in the Low Country. So just about the only building material that was available in really large quantities was bricks. So the British settlers that came here were forced to use them. Now in England, the brick was the poor man's building material, but in the Low Country, they didn't have a lot of options. So if you look to the left, to hide that, they would put stucco over the bricks, and then they would cut lines in it to make it look like stone. And we call that rendering. Now, a good rendering job would have been very expensive, but it would have looked just like stone. So when you're downtown and you think you're looking at a stone building, more than likely you're probably looking at bricks that have been stuccoed over. Not that many stone buildings in the city. Got Chalmers Street coming up on the right. It's the longest cobblestone street in the city. It's 2 blocks. We're going to see it again later. Cobblestones were used as ballast for the tall ships that were coming over from England. The masts were something like 100 feet above the water. And when the ships are coming over, they were coming over lightly loaded or empty, so they were top heavy. And to keep from capsizing, sailors would put the cobblestones in the bottom of their ships. Whenever the ships got over here, sailors would offload the cobblestones, ships were reloaded with goods from South Carolina, and then they would have headed back. Now typically, residents would have put sand or dirt over the top to smooth it out. And by around 1800, more than half of the city streets were paved with ballast stones. Now there's only 8 of them left. And cobblestones are smooth because they came from riverbeds in England and New England. And then you might have seen the rectangular stones downtown. Those are called Belgian blocks. And Belgian blocks were cut specifically to fit into the hulls of ships. Broad Street is right ahead of us. This was the center of the walled city. It's very cleverly named initially. At its widest point, it was about 100 feet wide. Runs from east to west.
Wow.
Yeah, 100.
What's that black thing doing right there?
Oh, that's trash comes out of this.
Trash comes down?
So the building at the end of Broad Street is called the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon. It's built in 1771. It's one of the last buildings constructed in the colonies with British money. And this was the city's Maritime Commerce Center initially. Now we're looking at the back of the building. The front of it would have been facing the water, and it's a whole lot more ornate. It would have attracted merchants to do exchanges here. We're talking about exchanges because there wasn't a universal monetary system initially. So we're going to turn on to East Bay Street in a moment. You might recall that this was the eastern boundary of the walled city. East Bay Street used to be right on the water. And at high tide, the dungeon in the old exchange building used to flood. So if we were rolling this way in the early 1700s, and if we looked to the left, a lot of the buildings over here would not have existed. So a lot of this on the left, not all of it, but a lot of it used to be underwater. And what happened is the land was filled in and built up. And we call that reclaimed land. And altogether, the city's built on about 35% reclaimed land. So 35% of this entire peninsula never used to exist. Reclaimed land is similar to landfill. Out at the edge of the city, people were dumping garbage and other stuff, and slowly but surely they built the peninsula out.
Wow.
And whenever you see land in the city that's sloping up or downhill, that often means that what you're looking at has been reclaimed, because there aren't any natural hills in the Lowcountry. And this section of town on our left is reclaimed starting in the 1820s. So most of the buildings over there aren't any older than that. So this blue house on the corner is where Rainbow Row starts. And Rainbow Row is the longest continuous stretch of colonial era buildings in America. So construction began here in the 1720s. Merchants had offices on the first floor, and they would have lived on the second and third floors. You'll notice these street names on the left. For example, Boyce's Wharf. Ahead of us, it's going to be North Adgers Wharf and South Adgers Wharf. So all of these streets on the left used to be wharves. Sailors would have docked to their ships, walked up the wharves, and talked to the merchants in Rainbow Row. So again, 300 years ago, this was the waterfront. And this section of houses wasn't called Rainbow Row until the 1930s. There was a photographer with National Geographic, and he came to photograph these, but he had black and white film in his camera. So when he described this in his article, he described it as a rainbow, and that's when Rainbow Row was named. And again, Rainbow Row, the longest continuous stretch of colonial era buildings in America, ends with the turquoise house on the corner. Supposed to pull over for traffic. That's good. Well, the city could slap us with an $1,100 fine if we block traffic. So I'm not doing it necessarily to be nice. And I haven't seen the middle finger in a really long time, so I want to keep the street going.
What are these residences now?
Yep. Yes, indeed. Private residences. This one is two separate units, 79 and 81. But yeah, they're private residences. Pretty much everything south of Broad Street is residential, for the most part. Now, traditionally, Broad Street is a socio-economic dividing line. We were slightly north of Broad with the haves, but now we're south of Broad over here with the have a whole lot mores. So again, a much nicer part of town, historically. And we like to put that differently, so when you're slightly north of Broad, you're with the snobs, and when you're south of Broad, you're with the SOVs. But when you're south of Broad, you're closer to the water, and when you're closer to the water, the sea breezes are a lot stronger. So pretty much from the beginning, and still today, south of Broad is a highly desirable part of the peninsula.
SOB and SNOB have the same letters in it.
When it comes to real estate prices south of Broad, in general, we're talking about 7 figures. So if you get property for less than 7 figures, that usually means that the property is going to need 7 figures worth of restoration.
All right.
So if you're not on the water, we're talking about $1 to $3 million. If you are on the water, it's going to be more like $4 to $8 million. So property on Rainbow Row sells for $1.5 to $2 million all day long.
You guys got a steal.
We got a greenhouse coming up. We're gonna see that the earthquake washers on this thing are shaped like stars. Because nobody said that a washer had to be a circle. Just a thought. So the greenhouse with the stars and the next 3 beyond it, they're all called single houses. So what you got with that thing, it's 1 room wide at the street, 2 or 3 rooms deep going back, with a side entrance, and then a porch, which we call a piazza. Piazzas always face south or west, because that's where the sun's rays are hitting. And the piazzas function a lot like umbrellas. And the single home was built perpendicular to the street, mainly for ventilation purposes. So these people would open up their doors and windows, and then they'd catch a sea breeze that would run the entire length of the house. So it's mainly about ventilation. But it's a very popular floor plan. There's at least 3,000 of them on the peninsula. Now you might notice that the street ahead of us is sloping downhill, and that's because it's reclaimed land again. And you have the harbor coming up. The Ashley River is ahead of us on the western side of the peninsula, and the Cooper River is behind us on the eastern side. And the Atlantic Ocean is about 5 miles out.
And what are these trees with a smooth bark?
These are called crepe myrtle trees. They're native to Southeast Asia, but here in Charleston is the first place in North America where they are successfully introduced.
Pretty.
Yeah, they're all over the South now. But again, they started in Charleston. They're really pretty when they're in bloom. All right, you got the gray house coming up. If you look midway up the wall and right below the roof, we have these exposed earthquake bolts.
Road I wanted to go on.
So not all of these things are still active. Some have been deactivated and cut, and then others were left alone. Now, once you straighten the walls out, you're not going to keep turning, otherwise you can damage the buildings. And there's a lot of debate as to whether or not the bolts have been effective. We know that they've created a very rigid building, but that's not really what you want in an earthquake. So we're guessing that all the unreleased tension created by the earthquake bolts during the next big earthquake might cause implosions. And again, we may or may not have another earthquake at some point, so we'll see.
Gorgeous.
You can't really predict earthquakes. They're either going to happen or they're not. But I mean, we are prone to earthquakes here, so. Rolling on.
Oh yeah, on the house.
This is called the Compromise House on the right. It's half Italianate and half Greek Revival architecture. So allegedly, a young and wealthy married couple couldn't make up their mind here, so they split it down the middle. It's 2 separate residences now. Now if you look 3 miles out to the left, there's a man-made island in the center of the harbor with a flagpole on it. You guys see it? Fort Sumter. And a somewhat inconsequential battle took place there about 155 years ago. I'm being sarcastic. So, rewind a little bit. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th of 1860. South Carolina was the very first state to secede. Fort Sumter was there back then, but the fort was deserted. And it was deserted because it was under construction. And it stayed deserted until 6 days after the secession, December 26th of 1860. Major Robert Anderson and his Union soldiers captured it in the middle of the night. No big deal because there wasn't anybody there, and then they raised the American flag. Residents woke up the next morning, they saw the flag flying, and they were kind of perturbed. And by April of 1861, they'd had enough. So General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, PGT Beauregard, he was commanding Confederate forces downtown. He sent a note to Major Robert Anderson, who was commanding Union forces at Fort Sumter, and he demanded that Major Anderson surrender. Nobody was going to back down, so at 4:30 in the morning on April 12th of 1861, it was guns from James and Morris Island, which are to the right of the fort, and then guns on barges that were floating in the harbor. They all fired at Fort Sumter for 34 hours. And once the battle was over, the Union garrison surrendered, and then the Confederates captured the fort, and they held it for the duration of the war. So, again, the first shots of the American Civil War were fired right out there. So, we're parked next to the Edmonston Alston house. This is built in 1825. The Alston family lives here on the 3rd floor, and these first 2 floors are what we call a house museum. So you take a tour of this thing. And this one's unique because about 80 to 90% of the furniture here is original to the house. And it's from the third-story piazza of the Edmonston Alston House where General Beauregard watched his men fire at Fort Sumter.
Remember that side yard?
Yes.
Back behind.
Yes,
These are called the babies of the battery. The yellow brick house is built in 1920. The gray house next to it is built in 1935. There was one home on these two lots until 1911 when the hurricane hit. A hurricane in 1911 sent a schooner crashing over the seawall and into the living room of the home that used to be here.
Holy moly.
So they knocked that one house down and built these two. But these are about 100 years newer than anything else on the block. That's why they're called babies of the battery.
babies of the battery.
And then you got the brick house with the green shutters. These earthquake washers are shaped like lions' heads. That is what we call rope molding around the door. Rope molding was the symbol of a merchant pretty much anywhere on Earth. And the thicker it was, and the more of it you had, the better off you were doing. Now the guy that built this house, I'm not making this up, his name was William Roper. He built this house in 1838, and he designed those columns to be seen from 3 miles out. Now, Roper built such a large house to attract other merchants. The rope molding and the columns would have been like a neon sign to a merchant. So merchants would have sailed into the harbor, they would have seen the William Roper house quite easily. They would have anchored their ships, rowed over to the seawall, dealt directly with William Roper at home. Because back then, merchants lived where they worked. Now that's called selling stuff on eBay. And when he built that house in 1838, the pink house wasn't here, nor was the gray house on the corner. So he had a pretty good panoramic view of all the action going on in the harbor and the rivers.
Wow.
The guns up ahead of us, that is part of what we call the battery. So the battery got its name during the American Revolution when guns were positioned there to protect the harbor. And the guns are sitting in White Point Garden. White Point Garden was a beach and an oyster bed 300 years ago. And the oyster shells that were bleached by the sun made this whole spot look white. Every gun in White Point Garden at one time or another has defended this harbor. These are live oak trees in White Point Garden. Most of the live oaks that are downtown were planted after the Civil War. And one of the oldest east of the Mississippi River is on John's Island. It's right down the road. The angel oak. That tree is roughly 1,500 years old. And its trunk circumference is 25 feet. You don't see the old oaks in the low country because oak was the predominant shipbuilding material until ironclads came along. So again, most of the older oaks got chopped down to build ships.
That'd be good firewood. I could burn that for a long time, couldn't I?
Now on the right, it's called the Villa Margarita. It was built in 1895. It's home to one of America's first indoor swimming pools.
Oh.
Now this house, along with so many others along here, was very heavily damaged when Hurricane Hugo hit the city in 1989. Hugo hit September 21st. It was a high category 4, sent about 14 feet of water downtown. Now Hugo was the last major hurricane to hit the city directly, and hurricane season runs from June 1st through November 30th. And then you got this Queen Anne Victorian coming up on the corner. Some people think that this one is shaped kind of like a wedding cake. Maybe. Now today it's the 2 Meeting Street Inn, but when this was built in the 1890s, it was Martha Williams' house. So in 1890, on her wedding day, Martha Williams woke up next to a satin pillow. So the story goes. On that pillow, there was a note from her father, and the note said to build the home of your dreams on the day of your dreams. Along with that note, there's a check for 75 grand. That was a lot of money in the 1890s, and this is what she built with it. And not to be outdone, the groom's family sent the couple on a 14-month honeymoon while the house was being built.
14 months.
Because the newlyweds wanted to do some furniture shopping in Europe. So Dad gave Martha the money to build this house. And we're going to see Dad's house here in a little bit. Taking a potty break. That's what the diaper's for.
Oh, take a look.
Yep. What's left of it. Good job, buddy. Oh, we missed a little bit. So whenever you miss the diaper or even a little bit, you got to drop a urine marker down. called the Equine Sanitation Company, and they'll clean up what we call the spill.
Huh.
He was the guy I was talking to earlier at the gate. Yeah.
Oh.
Coming up on the left, it's called the Welcoming Arm Double Staircase. It's a symbol of welcome here. The staircase gives the house symmetry. Obviously, human beings love symmetry. Also looks like this house is reaching out to hug visitors. Pretty common to find a Welcoming Arm Double Staircase in the Low Country.
I like that.
So again, Martha Williams was right behind us at the corner. Her father was named George. George built his brick house coming up on the right in 1876 for 200 grand. It's one of the largest houses on the Atlantic seaboard. It's 24,000 square feet.
Wow.
Now between 1863 and 1865, George made $2 million running the Union blockade of the Charleston harbor. So he's a blockade runner and a merchant. And we know that because he's got rope molding around every single door and every single window.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
And he's also got that design in every other fence post. It's called the Calhoun Mansion. One of John C. Calhoun's grandsons, I'm talking about twice Vice President John C. Calhoun, one of his grandsons, Patrick, came to inherit this home via a marriage. So, 24,000 square feet. It's the largest private residence in the city, but it's also another house museum. So you can take tours of this one.
okay. Wow.
Is that recent? I don't remember that.
How recent are you talking?
Within the last
4 or 5 years.
Oh, it's been at least 8 years, because it's been, yeah, probably longer than that.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a house museum.
How do you miss this one?
Yeah, I don't know.
You have to come down
There's a pair of mules coming up on the left, guys.
over that one.
Now, blockade running was pretty dangerous, by the way. On average, throughout the American Civil War, 1 out of 6 blockade running ships successfully ran their blockades. That means, on average, George lost 5 out of 6 of his blockade running vessels, but he still made $2 million. And again, Calhoun Mansion, named after Patrick Calhoun, John C. Calhoun's grandson. Again, John C. Calhoun died 26 years before that house was built. So again, not connected with John C., just Patrick. So in the French Quarter, we saw some pretty crummy rendering. If you look to this gray house on the right, up at the second floor, the bricks are exposed, but in general, this rendering is pretty good. So these people wanted the stone look, but they couldn't get their hands on stone, so they did the next best thing. And again, this on the right is about as good as it gets when it comes to rendering.
Yeah.
And this stretch of Meeting Street on the right is pretty typical of colonial era Charleston. We're talking about the homes that aren't very colorful. The pastel colors that you see today are kind of a modern innovation. During the colonial period, bright paint colors were very expensive. So in general, people couldn't afford to paint and repaint their exteriors with a really bright color. So typically, you're going to find the bright colors on the interior walls only. On the right, the Daniel Hugie House is built in 1760. On the left, the William Bull House is built in 1720. The William Bull House is 14 years older than the city of Savannah. Savannah is the oldest city in Georgia, so number 35 then is almost 300 years old. When number 35 was built in 1720, it was out in the suburbs. Heading north, and Water Street is coming up on the right-hand side. And you might recall that Water Street was the southernmost boundary of the walled city. Now, Water Street used to be Van Rost Creek. It was a tidal creek, T-I-D-A-L, meaning it would rise and fall with the tides. Van Rost Creek would have acted as a moat for the walled city. Since then, residents filled it in, paved it over, renamed it Water Street. And the southwestern boundary of the actual wall itself used to sit by the First Scots Presbyterian Church, which is up ahead of us. And the creek used to spill out into the Charleston Harbor. Also on the right, there's a fence coming up. On top of it, we're going to see a set of spikes. It's called Chevaux de Frise. So Denmark Vesey led an unsuccessful slave rebellion in Charleston in 1822. These people got paranoid and they installed the Chevaux de Frise on top of their fences as security. And these days, Chevaux de Frise is pretty rare. We'll talk about why a little bit later.
does.
First, coming up on the left is going to be House Museum number 3. It's the Nathaniel Russell House. He was a merchant from Rhode Island. He didn't bother with the rope. Now, the house is built in 1808, and inside of it, there's a free-flying spiral staircase. So with a free-flying spiral staircase, there's no substantial visible means of support. His neighbors, you'll find, were exceptionally quiet. So the graveyard is attached to First Scots Presbyterian Church. Graveyards are attached to churches and cemeteries are not. So you had 12 dissenting families. We're talking about 12 families that were trying to break away from the Church of England. They founded the congregation in 1731. The church was built in 1814. The 5th oldest church building in downtown Charleston. And again, very near to here is where the southwestern boundary of the walled city used to sit. We're going to turn on to Trad Street. The section of Trad Street we're going to see, it's like a snapshot in what the city would have looked like 300 years ago. The homes that we're going to see are packed in really tightly. You'll notice that there aren't any power lines overhead either. And in general, most of the homes on this part of Trad Street date from the early to mid 1700s. So again, this is like a 300-year-old time capsule. Looks exactly like the walled city. As a result, Hollywood loves filming movies here. You have an old and historic city pretty much right out of the box. Now you can move fire hydrants. We're talking obviously pre-digital cameras. These Hollywood guys would hire a lady in a hoop skirt, place her on top or in front of the hydrants, and they're not going to show up on film. Or you could use as an example, maybe a barrel or a pile of boxes. So there's lots of different ways to hide them, but now with digital cameras, it's a little too easy. All we got to do is erase them. Yeah. So when you're watching an old movie, bear in mind, static objects on the roadside might be hiding something else that's immovable. So lots of things have been filmed here. Cold Mountain, The Patriot, North and South, The Notebook, Dear John, that classic Ace Ventura Pet Detective #2, filmed in Charleston. Alright, so
Busy critter.
this animal pees more than any horse I've ever known, so, and he poops a lot too, which is a good thing. 56, okay, just make a mental note of that.
That's quite
You
a
have to
bit.
be kind of stupid to make a cell phone call on a carriage if you don't have to, so just wait till we get back to the barn. It's not really that big of a deal.
That was
Now, Trad Street is an architectural timeline. On the eastern end, the homes are older. When you go behind us and to the western end, the homes get newer. So, ahead of us, down by East Bay Street and the Cooper River, the homes on that part of Trad Street date from the 17-teens and 1720s. Behind us to the west end, down by the Ashley River, those homes date to the early 1900s. It's also the widest point on the peninsula. The peninsula is about 1 mile wide by 3 miles long. And we're going to turn on to Church Street in just a minute. We actually started the tour out on Church Street. See, East Bay Street, which we were on earlier, is about a block or two in front of us, so we're almost back where we were before.
This is so cool. I love this. I just love this.
Coming up on the
really
left
is.
is going to be House Museum number 4. It's the Hayward Washington House. Daniel Hayward built the house for his son Thomas in 1772. Thomas Hayward is one of the signers of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And when George Washington came to visit as president in May of 1791, he rented this house. So he slept here. Notice out in front there's a carriage stepping stone and a pair of carriage hitching posts. These things are still around today because they're protected by the preservation laws. In the horse and carriage days, there were no sidewalks, so these would have been less like streets and more like open sewers, and it would have been pretty handy to have a carriage stepping stone. Okay. So, picture George Washington. He would have woken up in the Hayward House on Sunday morning of May of 1791. He would have turned down Church Street. He would have turned again down St. Michael's Alley ahead of us. He would have worshipped at St. Michael's Episcopal Church. It's the oldest church building downtown, and the cornerstone was laid there in 1752. So if you look just beyond this yellow house on the left, you're going to see it. George worshipped at St. Michael's in Pew 43. We know that specifically because Pew 43 was reserved for dignitaries. And back then, Episcopalians were paying pew rent. Just like buying a concert ticket. Just saw St. Michael's. In a moment, you're going to see St. Philip's. And we're still south of Broad, so we're going to cross over Broad Street and slightly north of Broad.
There's a wealth management company.
It's a very sophisticated way to say it. Wealth management.
All right, buddy, come on.
Right next to the goat sheep cow.
I saw that.
Goat sheep cow.
Before we make the crossing over Broad Street, we're going to visit with the Hat Man. He's coming up on the corner.
Oh.
He is 19th century commercial art. 16 hats make up his body. And pretty much the only thing that's not a hat over here is his cane and umbrella. So there would have been a haberdashery on the corner. That's a men's clothing shop and a hat maker's shop. And the Hat Man was painted here in the 1880s to let us know. Workers are repainting that wall. They found him by accident. He was restored, and he's going to stick around because he's protected by the preservation laws.
Oh, sure.
Of course. In the South, in the 1880s, a lot of people were still illiterate. So in order to capture the largest audience possible, you'd advertise the pictures. And most of us have heard of the Mad Hatter. That wasn't Lewis Carroll's idea. Hat makers used to work with mercury. Turns out that prolonged exposure to mercury is going to make you go crazy. And eventually it's going to kill you. So mercury poisoning became so prevalent amongst hat makers that it became known as the Mad Hatter's disease. So mercury was used in the curing of animal pelts, and hat makers were inhaling mercury vapors. So it's a very dangerous profession once upon a time. Look to the left, you're going to see St. Michael's Episcopal Church, the oldest church building in downtown Charleston. On the left.
Must be.
Yeah, it's opening day for the Spoleto Festival. It's like a arts and music festival downtown.
Gee.
So,
That guy.
and that thing will run through the middle of June. All right, so we got palmettos on either side of us. These are very important here. Now, June 28, 1776, the Battle of Fort Sullivan's took place on Sullivan's Island in the harbor. Right before the battle, Colonel William Moultrie and his soldiers built the fort out of the logs. These things are very soft and spongy, and when the British were firing their cannons at the fort, they figured out that their cannonballs were bouncing off or not doing a whole lot of damage. So the British sailed away defeated. That was the first decisive American victory during the American Revolution. Later, the Battle of Fort Sullivan became known as the Battle of Fort Moultrie, and then the palmetto became our state tree. So that's why we're the palmetto state. The palmetto is also on our state flag. Now we call June 28 Carolina Day. South Carolina saw more Revolutionary War engagements than any other colony. 113. South Carolina had a very big loyalist population, meaning those that were loyal to the crown. So what you had, especially in the northwestern part of the state, were loyalists fighting against the Patriot militia. So sort of like a civil war going on in South Carolina during the American Revolution. This is Chalmers Street. 300 years ago, Chalmers Street was chock full with what we like to call houses of negotiated affection. So that's where your commerce for comfort would take place. It's fairly convenient because the old waterfront is only a few blocks to the right. So this was a very seedy part of town 300 years ago. Now the brick building on the left with the green trim is called the Dock Street Theater. The original was built in 1736. The original Dock Street Theater is one of the first buildings constructed in America solely for the purpose of putting on plays. This Dock Street Theater was built in 1809 and they're still putting on plays here today.
Have you been to one here?
Right across in the Dock Street Theater is the French Huguenot Church. Again, the congregation was established here by 1681. They built the church on this site by 1687. And the church building that we're looking at was built in 1845.
Wow.
It's home to the only French Calvinist congregation left in North America. This was called the Church of the Tides. In the beginning, the safest and most efficient way to travel was by boat. So for safety's sake, the congregation would time its church services with the incoming and outgoing tides. Queen Street used to be called Dock Street. That's why this is the Dock Street Theater. So Queen Street used to be a dock. These French Huguenots would have docked, gone to church, headed back out of the tides, right in the middle of the French Quarter. There would have been many churches downtown that you could have called the Church of the Tides, because everybody would have timed their church services with the tides. Straight ahead of us is St. Philip's. We saw this earlier. When this church was built in 1838, the city and the congregation were really at odds over the location of the steeple. The city wanted a street right here, and the congregation wanted its steeple right here. So these guys argued, they compromised, you can see this, they compromised by looping the street right around the steeple.
Yeah, actually the steeple one.
Now there used to be another church here before this one with a graveyard to go with it. So when they built this church in 1838 and cut the road through, they cut the graveyard in half. So now we have a graveyard on the right and a cemetery on the left. And when they cut the road through, they moved the headstones and put them up on the walls in the cemetery and the graveyard, but they did not touch the coffins. So yeah, you heard me right. The street was built directly over the remains. And they used to happen all the time. Sometimes it was accidental, sometimes it was intentional. In this case here, quite intentional. Now the iron at St. Philip's is unique because it's pre-revolutionary. Most iron in the city was donated to the cause between 1861 and 1865, and it would have been melted down to produce weapons. So if this iron is pre-revolutionary, that means that it never got donated. So in general, most iron in the city isn't any older than about 1861. About 80% of it was donated to the cause during the Civil War. And that means the chevaux de frise that we saw earlier is pretty rare, because most of that would have been donated too. And if you didn't donate your iron, you gave a whole lot of money instead.
I think he's going faster.
Now the street ahead of us is sloping downhill, and again, that means reclaimed land. So we're going to talk about how and why the market got reclaimed, but we got to turn on to Cumberland Street. Cumberland Street was the northern boundary of the walled city, also the northern boundary of the French Quarter.
He knows he's going home.
Yeah.
And then you got these earthquake bolts on the right. These are going to date the buildings if you think about it. Pre-earthquake buildings are probably going to have them, and post-earthquake buildings are probably not. These things were installed to repair damage. They're not installed to prevent damage in the future. And you got the palmettos, of course. Now there's palm trees and there's palmetto trees. And they look similar, but the easiest way to tell the difference is by looking at the branches. So, and I don't have any palm trees to show you, but with the palmetto, you've only got leaves at the tip of the branch. So the palmetto, the branches look like a broom. With a palm tree, you've got leaves going up the entire length. So with a palm tree, the branches look like a feather.
I didn't know that either.
Now these trees, if you try to water one of these things, well, you're not going to have any luck if you're going from the ground. These things get water from the top down. If you notice, they're almost growing in such a way as to catch water. So yeah, they get water from the top down.
Huh, I didn't know that either.
Palmettos are native to the low country. I'm not sure about palm trees, but they're like cousins. So we're going to turn down State Street, head into the market. At one time, the market was Daniels Creek. It was another tidal creek. And over time, Charlestonians were filling it in. Now, in the 1780s, a call went out for a common marketplace. So the Pinckney family and 5 other families, they all got together, and then they donated the land to build the market stalls. So by the 1780s, the first stalls were built. By 1807, the creek was totally filled in, and the last market stalls were constructed. To the west, up by Meeting Street, there's a building called Market Hall, which used to be the meat market. You could have bought produce in the center. To the east, down by the Cooper River, it used to be the fish market. And it's a common market for all goods. It's often referred to as the slaves market. There's a very prevalent misconception that slaves were bought and sold over here. Now, when we're saying slaves market, we're saying that with an apostrophe. It was a possessive term. Slaves were shopping and working here. So this land was donated to the city on a couple of conditions. One of those being that if slaves were ever sold here, then this land was just going to revert back to the donating families. So because it was illegal to sell slaves here, slave auctions took place pretty much everywhere else downtown. Now about 620,000 Africans were brought over to the United States as slaves. And about 40 to 60% of that number came to Charleston first. So Charleston is known as the Ellis Island of slavery. But again, no slave trading downtown took place in the slaves market. And this market, it's roughly at or below sea level, so it's the lowest point in downtown Charleston. As we get into the market, if you look carefully, a few bricks up in the ground of some of these buildings, you might see where the bricks go from darker to lighter. Whenever you see that, it's 200 years worth of water stains when the market floods. Notice the dark bricks. In any typical year, downtown is going to flood at least a dozen times. Like if you look into Haagen-Dazs on the left, you might see that a lot of these businesses in the market keep sandbags by their doors for the next time the market floods. And these are sweetgrass baskets on either side. They're part of a really rich West African heritage. Say that again? Right in the market over here. That's where our guys sell tickets. Our barn is on the other side of this building. Oh yeah, right through this pink building on the other side is where it is. Sure. Originally, these sweetgrass baskets were produced to what's called winnow rice, a step in the cultivation process. And the sweetgrass that's used to make them grows on the West African coast and also in the low country. They're all woven by hand, so they're super duper difficult to make, but also quite unique. And just about the only place on the planet where you can still find them is in the low country. They're part of the Gullah or the Geechee culture. Gullah is Gullah, Geechee is Geechee, Gullah Geechee, West African slave culture. Hey buddy. People tend to get a serious sense of sticker shock when they look at the baskets, but it's not just weaving the baskets. You gotta gather the grass, prepare the grass, and ultimately you can start weaving the baskets. So if you compare the amount of time those people spend doing all that compared to the amount of money that they get paid for weaving those things, it's basically a minimum wage job.
Oh yeah.
I'm heading out the northern bank of Daniels Creek. You saw it. Coming into the market, we were going down a hill. Leaving the market, we're going up a hill. Again, it's reclaimed land either way. Even though we're going up a hill and he's facing stiffer resistance, this is his favorite part of the tour. So Google thinks they're really fancy with those driverless cars, but we've been doing something similar for a whole lot longer. So he's turning into the parking lot without any help from me whatsoever. So if you-
this one.
Oh yeah. So if you guys have questions or need directions or recommendations or maybe your relationship advice or life coaching, I can help you out. But before you go, I'm supposed to collect your boarding passes, please. If you still got them. Collect those once I get my hands free. Hang tight for a little bit longer. We got to get this horse hooked up. We're gonna break some steps over for you to help you get off the carriage. If you guys want to say hi to de Blasio, that's perfectly okay. All I ask is that you approach him from the face. Pretty good rule of thumb. Even if a horse is dead, always approach it from the head. If you guys have any questions on the final approach?
Good job.
All right, thanks. We appreciate you guys coming out.
Thank you.
Sure. Sorry about the weather. Again, stand by for